Beginning with Prep Test 57, we started to see a new kind of question, and it's a question that a lot of people think of as a rule substitution question because it's asking us to find an answer that would act as a perfect substitute for one of the original rules. And this is typically how it would be asked. Which of the following, if substituted for an existing condition, an original rule, would have the same effect in determining the order? In this video, I want to break down the logic behind how to solve this kind of question. Now, first I want to start with a visual in case you're having trouble understanding what the question is asking us. Let's say this square here, this blue square, represents the people who are being protected from a horde of zombies. Everyone who is outside of the blue square is not under our protection. They will be eaten. The people in the middle, though, these are the people who are protected. Now, what if we no longer have this blue square? We just have the outline of the blue square. These are the people who used to be protected, but are now no longer protected. And let's say we want to find a new shape or set of shapes that would protect exactly the same group of people, no more and no less. So our first potential shape is this. Do you see how this green almost square doesn't quite get us to what we want? Because it does protect almost everybody that we want, but it's leaving out this portion over here. These people used to be protected, but now are no longer protected. This shape is under-inclusive of who we want to protect. What about this green square? Do you see how this square does protect everybody who used to be protected, but the problem is it goes a little bit too far and it's starting to protect people who we should have left to the zombies, right? These people at the outside of this dotted line, they should not be covered by this shape. So this is an over-inclusive shape. It's allowing people to survive who should not be allowed to survive. Consider this next shape. This one protects a lot of people who used to be protected, but it's both under-inclusive and over-inclusive, right? It's leaving out these corners. These people should be protected, but it's extending the protection too far, and these people outside the dotted line should be left to die. So this is not going to be a substitute either. How about this set of shapes? So it's really two different triangles put together, but do you see that if you do put them together like this, it covers exactly the same area that was protected before. So this would be a perfect substitute for the original shape. So the visuals that we just discussed are one way to help understand what we're looking for in a rule substitution question. The correct answer to a rule substitution has to meet both of these criteria. First, it cannot prevent arrangements that were allowed under the old rule. And the old rule here refers to the original rule that we're looking for a replacement for. Now, this criteria is like the one that helped rule out this first shape here, right? Under the first shape, it's not protecting this corner and they used to be protected, right? It's not allowing this set of arrangements, but this set of arrangements used to be protected, it used to be allowed. So this is not a substitute. This criteria is also something that would allow us to get rid of this shape because, again, it's leaving certain corners unprotected. These were arrangements of variables that were allowed under the original rules, but this is now not being allowed. They're not being protected. So this is gone. The second criteria that the correct answer has to meet is that it cannot allow arrangements that were impossible under the old rule, the rule that we're trying to replace. This criteria would help us get rid of this shape over here because it's protecting people outside of the dotted line. It's allowing arrangements that were not allowed under the original rules. Now, this criteria is also something that would allow us to get rid of this shape as well because it's protecting people who are outside of the dotted line. It is allowing arrangements of variables that were not allowed, not protected originally. Now, practically speaking, here are some questions that I have in mind as I evaluate these two criteria. For the first criteria, I'm asking this question. Does the new rule, meaning the rule in the answer choice that I'm considering, Does it say something that must be true under the original rules? If it's not something that must be true, then get rid of it, it's wrong. If it does say something that must be true, then it's past the first criteria, but we still have to apply the second criteria. And here's the question I have in mind to determine whether or not the second criteria is met. Does the new rule, if true, force the old rule to be true? Does it, if true, force the rule that I'm trying to replace to be true? If not, then we should get rid of it. And practically what that means is, if I can follow what the new rule says, but then come up with an arrangement that goes against what the old rule says, if I can do that, then it's wrong. The right answer should be one where if I follow what the new rule says, it's automatically going to make me follow what the old rule says as well. Now, all of this discussion is very abstract right now. Of course, we will take a look at a couple of examples to see these criteria in action. How do we actually work through a rule substitution question? So here we have a basic 5-letter ordering game. The rules were X is before Y has to come sometime before Q and W, R is before Q. So after you put those 3 rules together, you come up with a chain like this. And then if you think about who could go first and who could go last, then you'll see that R or X are the only ones that could go first. Q or W are the only ones that could go last. So now we're presented with a rule substitution question. Feel free to pause and try this on your own first. So this question is asking us to find a substitute for the first rule, the condition that X finishes before Y. Which answer will do the exact same thing in this game? Now, as you get more experience, sometimes you can actually have a pretty good prediction about how the LSAT might phrase a rule substitute, but in many cases, you're not going to be able to, and there's really no problem in that. The question doesn't have to be any more difficult. What I would do is just go into the answers and apply those 2 criteria that we discussed earlier. Now, sometimes you might want to apply one criteria at a time. So for example, just ask, does this have to be true? And just go down the line and then eliminate stuff that doesn't have to be true. And then go back to the remaining choices to ask, does this answer, if true, force the old rule to be true? Now, other times you might want to apply both criteria to one answer choice at a time. A lot of it just depends on how easy it is to apply those criteria to the answers. For this question, let me just apply one criteria at a time so you can understand the logic behind it more easily. So answer choice A says X finishes immediately before Y. Does this have to be true under the original rules that you had an XY block? Well, no, clearly not, because you could put the R in between X and Y. So A is not correct, because if you took what answer choice A said, put it in place of rule number 1, it would change the game. It would disallow, it would prevent certain arrangements that were possible under the original rules. The arrangement where R is in between X and Y. What about answer choice B, X finishes first or second? That was true under the original rules because X could never go 3, 4, or 5 because it has too many variables that have to come after it. So let's move on to C. Y finishes after X but before R. So Y finishes after X but the Y finishes before R. Was that true? Well, no, R and Y have no relationship to each other. Either one could go before or after. So C does not pass the first criteria. Answer choice D says the only person who can finish before X is R. And that was true under the original rules because every other letter besides R does indeed have to go after X. So if you wanted to put anyone before X, it would have to be the R. So D passes the first criteria. E says X finishes before Q and W finish. That was true under the original rules, so E passes the first criteria as well. Now let's go back and apply the second criteria. Does this answer, if true, make me put X somewhere before Y? Now at this stage in our analysis, rule number 1 is not in effect anymore, right? So you want to pretend like rule number 1 is not actually in effect. All the other rules, though, are still going to be in effect. And when it comes to our chain here, remember, rule number 1 is no longer in effect. So we no longer have to put the X before Y. The X is actually like a free agent variable at this stage in our analysis. So answer choice B says X must finish first or second. Does that force me to put X before Y? And so in blue, I'm going to see what we're trying to recreate. Well, if x finishes first or second, that still allows you to put y in 1, right? You could put y1, x2. So that does not force you to put x before y. What about answer choice D? The only person who can finish before x is r? Well, let's see. If that were true, and the only person who could finish before x is letter r, then yeah, every other letter, including the y, would have to go after the x. And so this answer does force me to follow the old rule. It does force x to go before y. It passes the first criteria. It was something that was true under the original rules, and so that would tell me it's correct. Now let's just review why E is wrong. X finishes before Q and W finish. So if this is true, X finishes before Q and W, that's just about Q and W. It doesn't tell me that X has to go before Y. You could still put Y in 1. And so that's why E is not going to be the answer. Now the way that we just solved this question was we used one criteria and went through all 5 answers, and then we went to the second criteria and then went to the remaining answers. That's not necessarily the way that you have to do it. Sometimes if there's an answer that's easy to evaluate where you can think, does this have to be true? And then right after that, if it passes that test, you can think, okay, now does that force X to go before Y? If you can do that kind of analysis and you see that it passes both criteria, then you can just pick that answer. So I don't want to make it seem like you have to do some full analysis of every answer like we just did. In fact, the way that answer choice D replaces the first rule, the LSAT has presented something like this a couple of times before. So after you get a lot of experience with games, you might get to the point where once you saw D, you would know that it's correct after you apply the 2 criteria. Let's take a look at another example. Here we have an in and out game where we have 5 different variables. The first rule says that if T is selected, then F is selected, and also vice versa. And so basically, they're always either going to be together in the in group or together in the out group. We also have a rule that says if T is selected, then J must be selected in the in group as well. And then the final rule says if T is selected, then M cannot be selected. The Y is a free agent variable. Now, if I were presented with this setup, I would definitely split based on the first rule because generally speaking, if I have a rule that says 2 letters always have to be selected together, then I'm going to put them in the different places they can go. So they're either in the in group or the out group. So that's what I would do for my split. Then I would apply rule 2 and rule 3 to the first world because that's where T is in. So that means I have to put the J in and I have to put the M out in that world. In the second world, since T is out, you don't have to worry about rule 2 and 3. They're never going to trigger. So that means then that in the first world, the only other letter that's remaining is RY that can go either in or out. In the bottom world, every other letter can go either in or out. There's no rule constraining any other letter. So here's what the ultimate setup would look like before we go into the questions. Go ahead and pause the video and try this one on your own first. This is asking which of the following if substituted for the condition that J must be selected if T must be selected, so that would be rule number 2, which one would have the exact same effect? Now, if you're particularly experienced with games, you might be able to recognize that, the T is part of a TF block type of relationship, and there's no other rule about F. So it's almost like the F and the T together constitute one variable. So one way that you could actually just replace rule 2 is to have a rule that says if F is selected, then J must also be selected. Because that would be the same as saying if T is selected, then J is selected, since F and T are always together. So if you can see that, then it wouldn't hurt to look at the answers and see if you find one that says if F is selected, then J has to be selected or something similar. And there is an answer that is based on that, but let me pretend like we didn't see that connection. How could we still solve this question fairly easily just based on our understanding of the 2 criteria that we were applying earlier, as well as the worlds that we have? So let me start with the first criteria. Does this answer have to be true under the original rules? A says if T is selected, exactly 3 others are selected. Well, no, you could put T in and just have FJ, right? You could put the Y out. So you could have 2 others selected, not 3 other students. So A is not true under the original rules. Answer choice B says if J is selected, then F must be selected. But do you see how in the second world you could put J in and F out? So B is saying something that wasn't necessarily true under the original rules, and so it's wrong. Answer choice C says F and M cannot both be selected, so you can't put both of them in at the same time. And that was true under the original rules, right? Here, you don't have both of them in, and over here, the F is already out, so you can't put both of them in. So it passes the first criteria. What about D? If J is not selected, then F cannot be selected. And so that was true because under the original rules, in the world where you could put J out, you do have to put F out as well. So let me move on then to answer choice E. The only students who can be selected with M are J and Y. Now that's also true as well because under the original rules, in the second world, which is the world where you could put M in, the only other ones that could go in with M are Y and J. So now we have to go back and apply the second criteria. Does this answer, if true, make it so that whenever you select T, you have to select J? And at this stage in our analysis, remember, rule number 2, it doesn't actually exist anymore. And so any of the inferences that we originally drew based on it also will not exist. So in the first world, remember T being in is what made the J go in? Well, now the J doesn't necessarily have to go in. In this world, the J would be a free agent along with the Y. In the second world, this rule didn't trigger anything, so you don't have to change anything in the second world. So now let's take a look at C. F and M cannot both be selected. Well, I don't really see why that would ever force J to go in, right? When T is in, there's really no rule anymore about J. So why would that force J to go in? You could put J out, so C is not going to be the answer. So now what about answer choice D? If J is not selected, then F cannot be selected. And you know what? To help me analyze this, I'm just going to do the contrapositive of D. What D is actually saying is if, this is answer choice D, it's actually saying if F is selected, then J is selected as well. That's the contrapositive of its current form. Does this rule here force it so that whenever T is in, J has to be in? And let's see. Well, if I were going to follow answer choice D, because F is in here, I do have to put J, and then it does recreate the rule, right? Because whenever T is in, answer choice D would then have me forced to select J. In the other world, T is out, so you don't have to worry about this when it comes to recreating rule 2. So that's what would tell me then that answer choice D is correct. Now let's go ahead and think about why answer choice E is not correct. E says the only students who can be selected with M are J and Y, so we're evaluating whether this rule, if true, makes it so that whenever you select T, you have to select J. Well, if the only students who can be selected with M are J and Y, that's just about this second world here, right? This is the world where the T is out. And this world is not relevant to proving that whenever T is selected, J has to be selected. So answer choice E does not have any effect on the relevant world. Now, practically speaking, the process that we use to solve this is not exactly what experts would be using to solve this question. What would probably happen is they would be able to get rid of answer choice A and answer choice B based on the first criteria. They're saying things that don't have to be true under the original rules. And then when it comes to C, D, and E, either they would recognize that answer choice D is just exactly what you might be able to anticipate. It's really just the contrapositive of saying if F is selected, then J is selected, which would make it so that whenever the TF block is selected, then J is selected. Or they'd be able to see that answer choice C doesn't have anything to do with J, so how would it ever force J to be in when there's no other rule about J? And the same thing with answer choice E, right? E is not going to say anything about what happens when T is selected. So that would probably be how an expert would get rid of answer choice C and E. But I think it does help when you're learning to actually think through each criteria for every answer choice and to prove out the correct answer in the way that we did, because that's what allows you to get to the point where you can more intuitively solve these questions. Now, another point that I want to make here about how we solve this question is to just remember the two different stages of analysis. So when we're applying the first criteria, does this answer have to be true under the original rules? We're pretending like the rule that we're trying to replace, rule 2, is still in effect. It's basically just, does this answer have to be true under the original rules, under the original game? But when we think about the next criteria, does this answer, if true, force the old rule to be true? That's where we would mentally want to X out that rule. It's no longer in actual effect right now for this stage of our analysis. And all other inferences that flowed from the original rule are also not in effect. The question is, does the answer, in connection with all the other rules, force the rule that we're trying to replace? Now, practically speaking, this second criteria is often harder to apply. And so if you're not yet at the point where you can finish 4 games reasonably well within time, your strategy in a timed section might be just to apply the first criteria, eliminate what doesn't have to be true, and then make an educated guess based on the rest. You won't necessarily want to be doing the work that I showed you to prove out the right answer. That's just something you'd want to do while you're reviewing a game.